Section 1 of the Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 1, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. Matilda of Flanders, Chapter 1, Part 1. Matilda, the wife of William the Conqueror, was the first consort of a king of England who was called Regina. This was an innovation in the ancient customs of the land, for the Saxons simply styled the wife of the king the lady his companion, and to them it was displeasing to hear the Normans speak of Matilda as La Reine, as if she were a female sovereign, reigning in her own right. So distinct in those days was the meaning attached in this country to the lofty title of reine or regina, from that of queen, which, though at present the highest female title of honor used in England, then only signified companion. The people of the land murmured among themselves as this unprecedented assumption of dignity in the wife of their Norman sovereign, yet the strange woman, as they called Matilda, could boast of royal Saxon blood. She was in fact the direct descendant of the best and noblest of their monarchs, Alfred, through the marriage of his daughter Elisabeth with Baldwin II of Flanders, whose son, Arnold the Great, was the immediate ancestor of Matilda, an interesting circumstance which history passes over in silence. Few of the queens of England, indeed, can claim a more illustrious descent than this princess. Her father, Baldwin V., surnamed the Gentle, Earl of Flanders, was the son of Baldwin IV by Eleanora, daughter of Duke Richard II of Normandy, and her mother was Adelicia, daughter of Robert, King of France, and sister to Henry, the reigning sovereign of that country. She was nearly related to the Emperor of Germany, and to most of the royal families in Europe. Matilda was born about the year 1031, and was very carefully educated. She was possessed of fine natural talents, and was no less celebrated for her learning than for her great beauty. William of Malmesbury, when speaking of this princess, says, "She was a singular mirror of prudence in our days, and the perfection of virtue." Among her other acquirements, Matilda was particularly famed for her skill in ornamental needlework, which in that age was considered one of the most important and desirable accomplishments which princesses and ladies of high rank could possess. We are told by a worthy chronicler, that the proficiency of the four sisters of King Ethelstan in spinning, weaving, and embroidery procured these royal spinsters the addresses of the greatest princes in Europe. The fame of this excellent stitchery is, however, all the memorial that remains of the industry of Matilda's Saxon cousins. But her own great work, the Bayeux tapestry, is still in existence, and is, beyond all competition, the most wonderful achievement, in the gentle craft of needlework, that was ever executed by fair and royal hands. But of this we shall have to speak more fully in its proper place, as a pictorial chronicle of the conquest of England. The Earl of Flanders, Matilda's father, was a rich, powerful, and politic prince, equally skilled in the arts of war and of peace. It was to him that the town of Lille, which he rebuilt and greatly beautified, owed its subsequent greatness, and the home manufactures of his native country, through his judicious encouragement, became a source of wealth and prosperity to Flanders. His family connection with the King of France, his suzerain and ally, and his intimate relationship to most of the royal houses in Europe, rendered his alliance very desirable to several of the reigning princes, his neighbors, who became suitors for the hand of his beautiful daughter. The most accomplished of these was the young duke, William of Normandy, who was not only desirous of this union in a political point of view, but passionately enamored of his fair cousin. Yet William, though no less remarkable for the manly beauty of his person than for his knightly prowess on the field, and his great talents as a legislator, had, in the first instance, the mortification of receiving a very discouraging reply to his suit, not only from the parents and kindred of the young lady, but also from herself. The fact was, Matilda had bestowed her first affections on a young Saxon nobleman, named Brithric Meow, who had visited her father's court in the quality of ambassador from Edward the Confessor, King of England. Brithric, surnamed Snow or Snow, from the fairness of his complexion, was the son of Algar, the lord of the honour of Gloucester, and possessed of very extensive domains in that country. He appears, however, to have been insensible to the regard with which he was distinguished by Matilda. This, together with the dark sequel of the tale, which will be subsequently related, is one of those authentic but obscure facts which occasionally tinge the page of history with the semblance of romance. It is more than probable that the passion which Matilda cherished for the fair-haired English envoy was the most formidable of all the obstacles with which her cousin, William of Normandy, had to contend during the tedious period of his courtship. A less determined character would have given up the pursuit as hopeless, but William, having once fixed his mind upon this marriage, was not to be deterred by difficulties or discouragements. It was in vain that his foes and jealous kinsmen intrigued against him in the Flemish court, that the parents of the lady objected to his illegitimate birth, and his doubtful title to the duchy of Normandy, that the Church of Rome interdicted a marriage between parties within the forbidden degrees of consanguinity, and, worse than all, the lady herself treated him with coldness and hauteur. After 7 years' delay, William appears to have become desperate, and, if we may trust the evidence of the Chronicle of Inger, he, in the year 1047, waylaid Matilda in the streets of Bruges, as she was returning from mass, seized her, rolled her in the dirt, spoiled her rich array, and, not content with these outrages, struck her repeatedly, and then rode off at full speed. This Teutonic method of courtship, according to our author, brought the affair to a crisis. For Matilda, either convinced of the strength of William's passion by the violence of his behaviour, or afraid of encountering a second beating, consented to become his wife. How he ever presumed to enter her presence again, after such a series of enormities, the Chronicle saith not, and we are at a loss to imagine. The marriage between the royal cousins took place in 1052, at William's own castle of Angiers, in Normandy, whither Matilda was, with great pomp, conducted by her illustrious parents and a noble company of knights and ladies. Wace, in his poetic chronicle of the Dukes of Normandy, says, that the count, her father, gave Matilda joyfully, with very rich apparellement, that she was very fair and graceful, and that William married her by the advice of his baronage. The royal mantle, garnished with jewels, in which Matilda was arrayed on the day of her espousals, and also that worn by her mighty lord on the same occasion, together with his helmet, were long preserved in the treasury of the cathedral of Bayeux. Lancelot mentions an inventory of precious effects belonging to the church, dated 1476, in which these costly bridal garments are enumerated. Immediately after the marriage solemnity, William conducted his fair and royal bride to Rouen, where, says Wace, she was greatly served and honoured. Nothing could be more perilous than the position of William's affairs at the period of his marriage with Matilda of Flanders. He was menaced on every side by powerful neighbours, who were eager to appropriate and parcel out the fertile fields of Normandy, to the enlargement of their respective borders, and at the same time a formidable party was arraying itself against him within his own dominions, in favour of Guy of Burgundy, the eldest son of his aunt Alice. This prince was the nearest legitimate male descendant of Duke Richard II of Normandy, and as the direct line had failed with Duke Robert, the late sovereign, he was, notwithstanding the operation of the Salic law, considered by many to possess a better right to the dukedom than the son of Duke Richard by Arlotta, the skinner's daughter of Falaise. The particulars of William's birth are too well known to require recapitulation, but it is proper to notice that there are historians who maintain that Arlotta was the wife of Duke Robert, though not of rank or breeding fit to be acknowledged as his duchess. This we are disposed to regard as a mere paradox, since William, who would have been only too happy to avail himself of the plea of even a contract or promise of marriage between his parents, in order to strengthen his defective title by a pretense of legitimacy, never made any such assertion. On the contrary, not only before his victorious sword had purchased for him a more honourable surname, but even afterwards he submitted to the use of the one derived from his mother's shame, and in the charter of the lands which he bestowed on his son-in-law, Alan, Duke of Bretagne, in Yorkshire, he subscribed himself William surnamed Bastardus. It is a general opinion that Arlotta was married to Herlewin of Conteville during the lifetime of Duke Robert, and that this circumstance prevented any possibility of William attempting to assert that he was the legitimate offspring of his royal sire. According to all historians, William was, from the very moment of his birth, regarded as a child of the most singular promise. The manful grasp with which his baby hand detained the rushes of which he had taken seizin, the moment after his entrance into life, when, in consequence of the danger of his mother, he was permitted to lie unheeded on the floor of his chamber, where he first saw the light, gave occasion to the oracular gossips in attendance on Arlotta to predict that the child would become a mighty man, ready to acquire everything within his reach, and that which he acquired he would with a strong hand steadfastly maintain against all challengers. It does not appear that Duke Robert bestowed much notice on the babe during the early stages of his infancy. Indeed, the contrary may be inferred from the testimony of the historian, who says, "When William was a year old, he was introduced into the presence of his father, and when Duke Robert saw what a goodly and fair child he was, and how closely he resembled the royal line of Normandy, he embraced him, and acknowledged him to be his son, and caused him to receive princely nurture in his own palace. When William was 5 years old, a battalion of boys of his own age was placed under his command, with whom he practiced the military exercise, according to the custom of those days. Over these infant followers William assumed the authority of a sovereign in miniature, and if dissensions arose among them, they were always referred to his decision, and his judgments are said to have been remarkable for their acuteness and equity. Thus early in life did the mighty Norman learn to enact the character of a leader and legislator. Nature had, indeed, eminently fit him for the lofty station which he was afterwards destined to fill, and his powerful talents were strengthened and improved by an education such as few princes in that rude, unlettered age were so fortunate to receive. At the age of 8 years, he was able to read and explain Caesar's commentaries. The beauty and early promise of this boy caused him to be regarded with peculiar interest by the Normans, but as a child of illegitimate birth, William possessed no legal claim to the succession. His title was simply founded on the appointment of the duke, his father. This prince, having no other issue, had centered all the doting affection of a father's heart on the young William, and feeling naturally desirous of securing to him the ducal crown, before he set out on his mysterious pilgrimage for the Holy Land, he called the peers of Normandy together, in the Hotel de Ville, and required them to swear fealty to his son, who he then solemnly appointed for his successor. When the princely boy, then a child of 7 years old, was brought in to receive the homage of the assembled nobles, Duke Robert took him in his arms, and, after kissing and passionately embracing him, he presented him to his valiant quens, as their future sovereign, with this remark, "He is little, but he will grow." The peers of Normandy gratified their departing lord by paying the homage required to the young William. The duke then appointed his vassal, kinsman and friend, Alan, Duke of Bretagne, seneschal of his dominions, with full power to govern the state of Normandy in his absence. Then he carried his son to Paris, and delivered him to the hands of the King of France, his suzerain or paramount lord. And having received his promise of protecting and cherishing the boy with a loving care, he made William perform the same homage to that monarch as if he were already the reigning Duke of Normandy, by which he secured the sovereign's recognition of the title of his little vassal peer to the ducal crown. After these arrangements, Duke Robert departed on this expedition, from which he never again returned to his own dominions. At the court of his sovereign, Henry I. of France, the uncle of his future spouse, Matilda of Flanders, William completed his education and learned the science of diplomacy, secure from all the factions and intrigues with which Normandy was convulsed. The states, true to the fealty they had sworn to the son of their deceased lord, sent ambassadors to Paris to claim their young duke. The king of France resigned him to the deputies, but soon after invaded his dominions. William, however, was possessed of energies equal to any difficulties in which he might be placed, and he had some faithful and powerful friends among the counsellors of his late father. Raoul de Gace and Roger de Beaumont stoutly maintained the cause of their young duke, both in the court and in the camp. They were his tutors in the art of war, and through their assistance and advice he was enabled to defeat the king of France, and to maintain the dignity of a sovereign and military chief, at a period of life when princes are generally occupied in childish amusements, or the pleasures of the chase. One by one, almost every Norman noble who could boast any portion of the blood of Rollo, the founder of the ducal line of Normandy, was incited by King Henry of France to stir up an insurrection, as a rival claimant of the crown. On one occasion, William would in all probability have fallen a victim to the plot which his cousin, Guy of Burgundy, had laid to surprise him, when he was on a hunting excursion, and was to pass the night without any of his military retinue, at the castle of Valognes. But from this peril he was preserved by the fidelity of his fool, who, happening to overhear the conspirators arranging their plan, travelled all night at full speed to give the duke notice of his danger, and finding means to make an entrance into the castle at 4 o'clock in the morning, he struck violently with the handle of his whip at the chamber door of his sleeping sovereign, and shouted, La vez, Signor, till he succeeded in rousing him. So close at hand, however, was Guy of Burgundy and his confederates, that it was only by mounting his swiftest steed, half dressed, and riding with fiery speed for many hours, that William could effect his escape from his pursuers, and even then he must have fallen into their hands, if he had not encountered a gentleman on the road, with whom he changed horses, his own being thoroughly spent. Guy of Burgundy was afterwards taken prisoner by the young duke, but having been on affectionate terms with him in his childhood, he generously forgave him all the trouble he had occasioned him, and his many attempts against his life. The king of France was preparing to attack William with redoubled fury, at the period when, by his fortunate marriage with Matilda, he strengthened his defective title to the throne of Normandy, by uniting himself with a legitimate descendant of the royal line, and at the same time acquired a powerful ally in the person of his father-in-law, the Earl of Flanders. The death of Henry averted the dark storm that lowered over Normandy, and the young Philip of France, his son and successor, having been left during his minority under the guardianship of his aunt's husband, Baldwin of Flanders, Matilda's father, William found himself entirely relieved from all present fears of hostility on the part of France. Scarcely, however, was he preparing himself to enjoy the happiness of wedded life, when a cause of annoyance arose, which had been little anticipated. Mauger, the Archbishop of Rouen, an illegitimate uncle of the young duke, had taken great pains to prevent his marriage with Matilda of Flanders, finding all the obstacles which he had raised against it were unavailing, proceeded to pronounce sentence of excommunication against the newly wedded pair, under the plea of its being a marriage within the forbidden degrees of consanguinity, and therefore unlawful in the sight of man and abomination to God. William indignantly appealed to the Pope against this sentence, who, on the parties submitting to the usual fines, nullified the Archbishop's ecclesiastical censures, and granted the dispensation for the marriage, on condition of the young Duke and Duchess each building and endowing an abbey at Caen, and a hospital for the blind. Lanfranc, afterwards the celebrated Archbishop of Canterbury, but at that time an obscure individual, to whom William had extended his protection and patronage, was entrusted with this negotiation, which he conducted with such ability as to secure to himself the favour and confidence both of William and Matilda, by whom he was, in after years, advanced to the office of tutor to their royal offspring, and finally to the highest ecclesiastical rank and power. William and Matilda cheerfully submitted to the conditions on which the dispensation for their marriage had been granted, by founding the sister abbeys of St. Stephen and the Holy Trinity. That of St. Stephen was built and endowed by William for a fraternity of monks, of which he made Lanfranc abbot. Matilda founded and endowed that of Holy Trinity for nuns. It should appear that the ground on which these holy edifices were erected was not very honestly obtained, as we shall have occasion to show hereafter. All that Maugre gained by his impertinent interference with the matrimonial concerns of his royal nephew was the exposure and punishment of his own evil deeds. For William, highly exasperated at the archbishop's attempt to separate him from his bride, retaliated upon him by calling a convocation of all the bishops of Normandy at Lisieux, before whom he caused Maugre to be accused of several crimes and misdemeanors, especially of selling consecrated chalices and other articles of church plate to supply his luxury. Maugre, being convicted of these malpractices, was deposed from his office, and Maulreuil was elected in his room. All things being now tranquilly settled, William proceeded to build a royal palace within the precincts of St. Stephen's Abbey, for his own residence and that of his young duchess. The great hall, or council chamber, of this palace was one of the most magnificent apartments at that time in Europe. Matilda, inheriting from her father, Baldwin of Lille, a taste for architecture, took great delight in the progress of these stately buildings, and her foundations are among the most splendid relics of Norman grandeur. She was a munificent patroness of the arts, and afforded great encouragement to men of learning, co-operating with her husband most actively in all his paternal plans for the advancement of trade, the extension of commerce, and the general happiness of the people committed to their charge. In this they were most successful. Normandy, so long torn with contending factions, and impoverished with foreign warfare, began to taste the blessings of repose, and, under the wise government of her energetic sovereign, soon experienced the good effects of his enlightened policy. At his own expense, William built the first pier that ever was constructed, at Cherbourg. He superintended the building and organization of fleets, traced out commodious harbors for his ships, and in comparatively short time rendered Normandy a very considerable maritime power, and finally the mistress of the Channel. Meantime, the domestic happiness which William enjoyed with his beautiful duchess appears to have been very great. All historians have agreed that they were a most attached pair, and that, whatever might have been the previous state of Matilda's affections, they were unalterable, and faithfully fixed upon her cousin from the hour she became his wife, and with reason, for William was the most devoted of husbands, and always allowed her to take the ascendant in the matrimonial scale. The confidence he reposed in her was unbounded, and very shortly after their marriage he entrusted the reins of government to her care, when he crossed over to England to pay a visit to his friend and kinsman, Edward the Confessor. By his marriage with Matilda, William had strengthened this connection, and added a nearer tie of relationship to the English sovereign, and he was, perhaps, willing to remind the childless monarch of that circumstance, and to recall to his memory the hospitality he had received, both at the Flemish and Norman courts, during the period of his adversity. Edward received him very honourably, and presented him with hawks and hounds, and many other fair and goodly gifts, says Wace, as tokens of his love. Duke William had chosen his time for this visit during the exile of Godwin and his sons, and it is probable that he availed himself of their absence to obtain from Edward the promise of being adopted as his successor to the English throne, and also to commence a series of political intrigues, connected with that mighty project which, 14 years afterwards, he carried into effect. In pursuing the broad stream of history, how few writers take the trouble of tracing the undercurrents by which the tide of events is influenced. The marriage of Tostig, the son of Godwin, with Judith of Flanders, the sister of Matilda, wife of William of Normandy, was one great cause of the treacherous and unnatural conduct, on his part, which decided the fate of Harold and transferred the crown of England to the Norman line. During the period of their exile from England, Godwin and his family sought refuge at the court of the Earl of Flanders, Tostig's father-in-law, from whom they received friendly and hospitable entertainment, and were treated by the Duke and Duchess of Normandy with all the marks of friendship that might reasonably be expected, in consideration of the family connection to which we have alluded. 9 months after her marriage, Matilda gave birth to a son, whom William named Robert, after his father, thinking that the name of a prince, whose memory was dear to Normandy, would ensure the popularity of his heir. The happiness of the royal pair was greatly increased by this event. In fact, nothing could exceed the terms of affection and confidence in which they lived. They were at that period reckoned the handsomest and most tenderly united couple in Europe. The fine natural talents of both had been improved, by a degree of mental cultivation very unusual in that age, and there was a similarity in their tastes and pursuits, which rendered their companionship delightful to each other in private hours, and gave to all their public acts that graceful unanimity, which could not fail of producing the happiest effects on the minds of their subjects. The birth of Robert was followed in quick succession by that of Richard, William Rufus, Cecilia, Agatha, Constance, Adela, Adelaide, and Gundred. During several years of peace and national prosperity, Matilda and her husband employed themselves in superintending the education of their lovely and numerous family, several of whom, according to the report of contemporary chronicles, were children of great promise. No very remarkable event occurs in the records of Matilda's court till the arrival of Harold in the year 1065. Harold, having undertaken a voyage to Normandy in an open fishing boat, was driven by stress of weather into the river May, in the territories of the Earl of Ponthieu, by whom, with the intention of extorting a large ransom, he was seized and immured in the dungeons of Boulogne. The Duke of Normandy, however, demanded the illustrious captive, and the Earl of Ponthieu, understanding that Harold's brother was husband to the Duchess of Normandy's sister, thought it was most prudent to resign his prey to the family connection by whom it was claimed. Harold was treated with apparent friendship by William and Matilda. They even offered to bestow one of their daughters upon him in marriage, a young lady whose age did not exceed 7 years, and to her Harold permitted himself to be affianced, though without any intention of keeping his plight. William then confided to his reluctant guest the tale of his own adoption, by Edward the Confessor, for his successor, and proceeded to extort from him a solemn oath, to render him all the assistance in his power, in furtherance of his designs on the crown of England. Harold, on his return to England, came to an open rupture with his brother Tostig. Probably he had, during his late visit to Normandy, discovered how entirely the latter was in the interest of his Flemish wife's connections. Tostig then fled, with his wife and children, to the court of his father-in-law, the Earl of Flanders, and devoted himself entirely to the cause of William of Normandy. At this perilous crisis, when so dark a storm was slowly but surely gathering over England, a woeful deterioration had taken place in the national character of the people, especially among the higher classes, who had given way to every species of luxury and licentiousness. William of Malmesbury draws the following quaint picture of their manners and proceedings at that period. Englishmen, he says, had then transformed themselves into the strange manners of the French, not only in their speech and behavior, but in their deeds and characters. Their fashion in dress was to go fantastically appointed, with garments shortened to the knee, their heads shorn, and their beards shaven all but the upper lip, on which they wore long mustaches. Their arms they loaded with massive bracelets of gold, carrying withal pictured marks upon their skins, pounced in with divers colours, by which it is evident that the Anglo-Saxons had adopted the barbarous practice of tattooing their persons, like the rude aborigines of the island 11 centuries previous. They were, continues our author, accustomed to eat to repletion and to drink to excess, while the clergy wholly addicted themselves to light and trivial literature, and could scarcely read their own breviaries. In a word, they had, according to the witness of their own chronicles, arrived at that pass of sensuality and folly which is generally supposed to provoke a national visitation, in the shape of pestilence or the sword. The Normans of that period, says Malmsbury, were proudly apparelled, delicate in their food, but not gluttonous, a race inured to war, which they could scarcely live without, fierce in rushing upon the foe, and, when unequal in force, ready to use stratagem or bribery to gain their ends. They live in large houses with economy. They wish to rival their superiors. They envy their equals and plunder their inferiors, but not unfrequently intermarry with their vassals. Such were the general characteristics of the men whom William had rendered veterans in the art of war, and, both by precept and example, stimulated to habits of frugality, temperance, and self-control. A mighty sovereign and a mighty people, possessing within themselves the elements of every requisite that might ensure the success of an undertaking which, by every other nation in Europe, must have been considered as little short of madness. When the intelligence of King Edward's death, coupled with the news of Harold's assumption of the regal dignity, reached the court of Normandy, William was struck speechless with indignation and surprise, and is said to have unconsciously tied and untied the rich cordon that fastened his cloak, several times, in the first tumults of his agitation and anger. He then gave vent to his wrath, in fierce animadversions on Harold's broken faith, in causing himself to be crowned King of England, in defiance of the solemn oath he had sworn to him to support his claims. William also complained of the affront that had been offered to his daughter by the faithless Saxon, who, regardless of his contract to the little Norman princess, just before King Edward's death, strengthened his interest with the English nobles by marrying Algitha, sister to the powerful Earls Morcar and Edwin, and widow to Griffith, Prince of Wales. This circumstance is mentioned with great bitterness in all William's proclamations and reproachful messages to Harold, and appears to have been considered by him to the full as great a villainy as the assumption of the crown of England. Some of the historians who wrote near that period say that the lady Adelicia, the affianced bride of Harold, was dead at that time, but if so, William could have had no pretext for upbraiding him with the insult he had offered to his family by entering into another matrimonial alliance. End of section 1.